Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 12th edition of Think Tent. The TPA has been hosting this space alongside various partners over the years, but this year it's just us, and it's our 12th edition. We're delighted to be back because while the Conservatives are not in government, they're certainly in the market for ideas, and we wanted to kick off specifically with an event that looked at a radical idea that the TPA proposed way back in 2012, which was the single income tax. It was a painstaking piece of work that we put together over the course of about 18 months. We did it in conjunction with the Institute of Directors at the time. We had some fantastic commissioners, several of whom are on the panel today, and it proposed, in short, a single income tax on distributed income. So on flows of income, they're only taxed once at a single rate, and no flow of income is taxed twice. The idea would be obviously to encourage investment, jobs, and growth. And I think one of the key aspects of the single income tax was its neutrality, i.e. the tax system should not choose a particular industry it likes, and it can't be misused by politicians to pick winners and pick friends. It's neutral on how you do business as long as you do it lawfully. The final report of the single income tax looked at the economic case, of course, but it also spent many pages looking at the moral case for lower taxes and simpler taxes, crucially. I think that was a really important aspect of the report. The obvious things being personal responsibility, people spend their own money more effectively than politicians can, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously the context at the time, 2012, George Osborne was the Chancellor, started out as Chancellor in 2010, overseeing a tax code of 11,000 pages. It's now 25,000 pages. So despite the presence and existence of the Office for Tax Simplification, that didn't really work out well. For the TPA, just to be very navel-gazing for 1 minute, the single income tax has allowed us a lot of space to be clear and consistent on how we campaign. Every time we launch a campaign on a particular tax, beer duty, inheritance tax, whatever it might be, we've got a clear and consistent intellectual case for what we're trying to do. I think the TPA has always been pretty clear in what it wants to do, but having that intellectual bedrock was quite an important moment for the organisation. And I'm delighted to be joined by a brilliant panel to discuss all of this and more. So as well as the report itself, we're obviously going to talk about some international lessons. We're going to talk about the political risks of tax reform and the opportunities of tax reform, and much more besides. I'm privileged and honoured to be joined by the two founders of the TPA on today's panel to kick off Think Tent. I think that's a really lovely moment for us. We've got Lord Elliot of Micklefelt and Andrew Allam, and we're also joined by Andrew Lillico, Tally Fraser and Ted Bromond. We're going to get going. Lord Elliot, over to you.
Thank you, John. First of all, many congratulations for Think Tent and keeping it going over 12 years. And it's fantastic to see, yet again, another event with sort of standing room only and having the battle of ideas right at the heart of Conservative Party conference. And it's also nice to have the opportunity to reminisce a bit about the 2020 Tax Commission, which ran from, I think, 2010 and was then published in 2012 from memory with the single income tax report. And to be on the same panel as two of the commissioners, Andrew Allam and Andrew Lillico. But it should be said that really, I remember that process of pulling the report together. At all points, it was really John O'Connell and Matt Sinclair who held the pen. So thank you for all the thought leadership you did during that whole process. Why did we set up the 2020 Tax Commission back in the day? Well, really, it was because tax had become hugely complex and the tax levels were too high. And this had led to very low growth rates within the UK. And it's first reflecting a little bit on the tax code over time. And I went back to the Institute for Chartered Accountants stats on the length of the tax code, just to sort of track back how it had changed over the past roughly 50 years. And if you go back to 1978, 79, the sort of time when Margaret Thatcher was coming into office, the tax code stood at 2,000 pages long in the UK. By the end of that period of Conservative government, it had gone to 7,250 pages. So by 1997, it had grown by another 5,000 pages to 7,250. Then you have that span of sort of Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and it doubled in size. It went from 7,000 odd to 14,000 by 2010, when we set up the 2020 Tax Commission. And it was the longest tax code in the world by that point. And then it grew as well, under the period of coalition government and Conservative government. By 2019, 2020, it had reached 25,000 pages long. And then, we'll have to work out why this was, in 2020, it fell. Who do you believe this? To 20,000 pages long, by 5,000 pages. I think it was something to do with the events of the 30th of January 2020, when we left the EU. So it fell, but then it grew back up again to 25,000 pages long by the end of the period of government. So you can see, over the course of those 50 years, it's gone from being a couple of thousand pages long to being 25,000 pages long and the longest tax code in history. So you might say, did the 2020 Tax Commission make a difference to politics? And I would say it did. As John mentioned, it led to the formation of the Office for Tax Simplification. It must be said, at great cost and not achieving very much. I wish they just implemented the plan. That would have been a far simpler thing for them to do, but sadly not. But it led to the setup of that. But also it got the government thinking. And I do remember when we launched the single income tax plan, having a meeting with Rishi Sunak, who was then a new MP, a backbencher, and he actually came along to the meeting with the full volume of the single income tax, all marked up with highlighter pen and post-it notes. When he spoke to John and myself and Alistair Heath, the chairman of the commission, about the plan, he'd actually thought it through. He had actually read it and thought about it. And so it did actually influence, I think, the thinking of some of the key people within the government. I think one of the crucial things to mention is the fact that it also had a spending component. This came a few years later. In 2015, you published a spending plan, didn't you? Which, again, was a similar thickness in terms of the volume of literature. And that went into the spending cuts that would be needed to actually implement a big tax change within the UK. And it's important that you always have the tax and the spending working together. So is the piece of work still relevant? I would say absolutely it is, not least because the tax code has gone up, but more importantly because if you look at the UK's GDP per capita, how wealthy we are as individuals, it's at really, really low levels and atrociously low. Before the financial crisis, UK growth was about 2.5% a year. Post-financial crisis, I'm afraid it's been more like 1.5%. That's not in least due to the complexity of the tax system, the high levels of tax, the high levels of spending, the high levels of regulation, all sorts of other things like that have bunged up the economy, leading to those low levels of growth. So it's still needed more than ever. If you read one thing from the report, do look up the executive summary. And there's a beautiful forward to that, written by the chairman, Alistair Heath, and almost word for word, it could be repeated. Again, I won't read it out to you, but it could be repeated now. So it talks about the UK facing a choice. And that choice is basically, do we continue along the current path of taxes going up, tax becoming more complex, regulation increasing, and basically see the UK economy stalling? Or do we take the opportunity to go down a different route of actually simplifying the tax system, cutting taxes, cutting spending, cutting regulation, and actually freeing up the economy to get growth going? And we have that clear choice in front of us. I got to give a plug for the book. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is that allowed? I've got a book coming out at the end of October. written by myself and Dr. Art Laffer, Michael Hintzey, and Douglas McWilliams. We look into the case for prosperity through growth and actually look at how you can bring about prosperity. And part of the book looks at basically where the UK is within the World Growth League tables. And what we'll have if we continue along the current growth trajectory is actually by 2030, the UK will be overtaken in terms of GDP per capita by Lithuania. Then by 2040, if we continue along the current path, we'll be overtaken by Poland in terms of GDP per capita. And by 2050, again, if we do nothing, if we choose to do nothing, we're overtaken by Turkey. So we do have that choice in front of us. And I think it's fantastic that the TPA and Think Tent are having the debates about this so you can go along the right path. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Andrew Allen, I'm going to come straight to you. Andrew is a co-founder of the Taxpayers Alliance and our former chairman and consultant for...
Thank you, John. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Fantastic to see a very well-attended event at the conference, and really delighted to be back with the TPA here. So I know a few people in the room based on being former chairman of the TPA, but my career for 30 years is as a business advisor in corporate strategy, advising big decisions in business. And always, when they come to pay fees like ours, to be honest, there is capital at stake. Those are the questions that people pay a lot of money to make. Those questions about investing capital, right? You can't ask workers to take the risk on the future. You need capital to take that risk. The workers need to be paid whether the business succeeds or not. You need capital there to fund the growth, be it new facilities, new markets to enter, M&A, for new, better ownership, new models. There is inherent risk in the future. Right? And capital is the way we can grasp the benefits of those opportunities. Without capital investment, things will atrophy. Matthew talked about the slow growth in this country. That problem is about 20 years old. Dates back to the mid-2000s. Most sectors started to slow down before the financial crisis. The high point of Blairism, we thought things were fine. Capital investment was low and growth has been low, and those two things are fundamentally connected. Fundamentally connected. So, how does this link to the Tax Commission? Well, if you're going to invest some capital, right, the Dan Needles of this world, the tax policy associates, those guys on the left, they say entrepreneurs don't think about taxes when they dream up their ideas. Maybe true, they're the dreamers. But unless they're going to bootstrap it, they will need some capital. And investors always do think about taxes. When I'm calculating a net present value for clients, it's a post-tax discount rate I'm using. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Pre-tax is for regulators, which Andrew knows a lot about, right? But in the business world, it's post-tax. What return will I get? Will it compensate me for my risk? And those assessments of the cost of capital are deeply embedded in human psychology, in the rational side of human psychology, risk aversion, right? I don't think that's debated much. Even on the left, they don't deny that. They don't like returns to capital, but they can't deny that it's embedded. Capital needs a good return to fund the opportunities. Therefore, it needs low, simple taxes that you can predict. That's where this came in. And if government had done this, we would have been far ahead. And in the rankings that Matthew's talking about, we wouldn't face being overtaken by countries that traditionally are much poorer than us.
Andrew, thank you very much. Next, Andrew Lillico. Andrew is the Executive Director of Europe Economics and was a Commissioner on the 2020 Tax Commission. Andrew, over to you.
Yes, so one thing I should perhaps say is that although I was a commissioner, I was a dissenter on a couple of points. In particular, I was a dissenter on the idea of having a single flat income tax. The one thing, the things I can perhaps talk about why why that's my view on questions later. But the thing I've been asked to focus on more here was on the spending side. So one important dimension of the Commission was the aspiration to reduce spending to 33% of GDP. Now, at the time, that didn't seem such an implausible figure to reach. After all, in the early 2000s, spending had been about 35% of GDP. Now, on the other hand, the 33% of GDP target seems wildly unrealistic. We currently have about 45% of GDP. If it had been 33% instead this year, that would have been about 360 billion pounds less. 360 billion pounds of spending cuts might be ambitious under most definitions. Now, the reality is that spending has been allowed to go so high that it becomes unrealistic to talk about various kinds of possible tax changes in that kind of context. And it's actually happened very recently, this rise. So that you understand, you only have to go back to 2018, 2019, and we were still around 38% of GDP spending. This is something, so we had a huge rise in spending under the early period of Boris Johnson, and he kept it there after COVID, when we could have chosen to reduce it. We'd taken every opportunity to put it up, and of course, the Tories put it up very high. They had planned to keep it very high for a very long time, and Labour has carried on and extended that. Going along with that, we've now raised taxes very, very high. The tax levels that we have, so they are at unprecedentedly high levels of tax relative to GDP. The national accounts taxes are 37% of GDP this year. As recently, so a decade ago, they were under 33%. So you've got a very large rise, and it's not merely a large rise, it's a rise which has never been sustained at these levels in the past. And I don't think it was ever going to be feasible for it to be sustained at these levels. So what I think will happen is that the government is already starting to happen, and I think it will happen more, is that the government will miss its targets for deficit reduction. So the spending is too high. We're at a 5% of GDP deficit in 2024. It's scheduled to go down this year. We'll see whether that actually happens. Hasn't been below 5% of GDP since before COVID. Now, many of you may remember the old Maastricht convergence criteria. It may not have been the most popular thing in the world at the time, but part of that, you may recall, was that one was supposed to have below a 3% of GDP deficit. So we're way above that, been way above that for years, have no chance of getting anywhere near that. And of course, a 3% of GDP deficit made sense, perhaps, as a target in a context in which you were growing around a couple of percent of GDP and you were going to have under 2% inflation. If we have 5% of GDP deficit and we have 5+% interest rates, then we're going to find that with 100% debt to GDP ratio, the debt to GDP is just going to increase continuously. We have no chance of sustaining that with our current kinds of inflation levels. It's just inconsistent. And I think that we are well on the way to a fiscal crisis. Now, one thing about that is that you might think, oh, well, that sounds catastrophic. In a sense, it is, humiliating and various other things. But of course, the IMF bailout of the 1970s, which was indeed humiliation, that was when we began the thing which we now call Thatcherism. It began then, the various elements, the monetary targeting, the spending cuts. That's the one time, by the way, the NHS was ever cut, was in the mid-1970s under the IMF program. The privatization began under the IMF in 1978 with the BP, British Petroleum privatization. That was when Thatcherism began. And if you have a consistent period of good policy, you can turn things around. So everybody thinks about how terrible stuff was in the period after the war to the mid-1970s. But by 2100, the UK was back to being the world's fourth largest economy, down only one position on our position from 1900. And the world's second, had the second highest level of net assets, foreign assets in the world, down only one position again from 1900. So with 25 years of solid policy, you can make things a lot better. Unfortunately, the past 25 years have been 25 years of pretty terrible policy. But nonetheless, now, if you're going to cut spending, a message that I would give to the Conservative Party, if anybody's interested in hearing, is you have to cut the items where the spending went up the most. the biggest failure of the austerity program of the early 2010s was the ring fencing. It was the ring fencing of things like the NHS and the schools. Where the spending had gone up, you decided the spending was going to carry on going up. So we had a few days ago an announcement that the Tory party is going to keep the triple lock on pensions. Well, come back to me when you're serious. If you're not going to abandon the triple lock, if you're not going to abandon the triple lock and you're not willing to see the NHS spending full relative to GDP and relative to other items of spending, go away and come back when you've got something to say, right? Because that is not realistic at all. The kinds of numbers that you're going to need if we do face a fiscal crisis are going to be well north of 100 billion, maybe 200 billion this time. Remember, we cut by well over 100 billion back in the early 2010s, and things weren't as bad as they are now. So it could be the kinds of numbers which we ought to be looking at doing are 300 billion, not straight away. I mean, the 100 billion will have to happen pretty quick. But where we want to get back to one day is back to the kind of situation we were in the early 2000s, when we had the 35% of GDP, which was the reasonable aspiration, perhaps ambitious, but an ambitious target which was set by the Tax Commission at the time. I've got so one other thing that I would just want to say is that I've probably taken more than my time already, but tax complexity is unjust. It creates injustice. And one of the things that it does is that it creates the rule of men rather than the rule of law. Because what happens is that you then empower bureaucrats with enormous discretion to decide whether your particular minor infraction, because you couldn't possibly work out what those 25,000 pages of the tax code were supposed to tell you to do, is something which they're going to pursue or they're going to let you off. And similarly, if you're like in some figure in public life, then you empower the journalists or the other politicians to decide, are they going to pursue you or are they going to let you off? We've seen all kinds of politicians, both in Labour and on the Conservative sides, have been brought down by relatively minor tax infractions. This kinds of, the system which we have, that ought to tell them that the system is too complex. If you have too much complexity, what you want is a system where people can know whether they're going to comply, and then they comply. You don't want a system in which you empower bureaucrats, somebody on high, far away, who bows down and decide which of the various people are going to allow to do things. That's unjust. And in due course, it also creates various kinds of petty corruption. I don't necessarily mean bribes, but it means that if you have the right sort of influence, if you have the right kind of DEI credentials or whatever, then they don't necessarily pursue you. In due course, it might be the opposite. We could be a Trump if you have kind of anti-DEI credentials going the other way. Maybe they decide not to pursue you in the future. I don't know. But it's going to be that kind of thing, I think, is unjust and is an important dimension. I'll shut up now and let somebody else speak.
Yeah. Well worth you going over your time there, Andrew, no problem whatsoever. Let's continue to broaden this out slightly. I want to go to Dr. Ted Bromond, formerly of the Heritage Foundation in the US, and now consultant.
Thank you so much, John. Andrew, I could not agree more with what you said about good policy being its own reward. And it's been such a pleasure for me over many years to be associated with the TPA, and with friends like Lord Elliott, John, both of the Andrews. So I just want to thank them and the TPA as a whole for their leadership on all of these important issues. I want to bring a little bit of good news from the United States. There's plenty of bad news coming from the US, and I'm happy to take questions, complaints, comments, or brickbats on that in the Q&A session. But I want to bring a bit of good news. But first, I want to start off by saying that on a fundamental level, the US and the UK have very similar problems. There is too much spending, there's too much regulation, taxes are too high, there is too much borrowing, and there are too many unsustainable promises made to future generations and indeed to current ones that cannot possibly be funded. A reckoning is due in both the US and the UK, and although the numbers are a little bit different, the basic situation is very similar. I'm reminded in all of this of a wise word from Winston Churchill. Trying to tax yourself into prosperity is like trying to lift yourself up in a bucket when you're standing inside of it. It is not possible. you might think that the good news from the U.S. would come from the national level. That's not really the case. I will give a modest degree of kudos to President Trump for the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Really rubs me the wrong way to use these ridiculous terms, into law. There were some good elements in this tax legislation. The Big Beautiful Bill Act did reduce marginal tax rates in the U.S. It did reduce some brackets. It did zero out some exemptions, and it was a tax cut for, or rather a continuation of previous tax cuts for about 62% of the population. Good as far as it goes. But this is not a flat tax. This is not really a meaningful tax simplification. The real revolution in U.S. tax policy is happening at the state level, where there really has been a flat tax revolution over the last 5 years. Already in the U.S., 9 states have zero income tax, no income tax whatsoever, including some very big states like Florida. 14 U.S. states have a flat tax, and 5 have adopted a flat tax from 2021 through 2024, including Arizona, Iowa, Mississippi, Georgia, Idaho, and Louisiana. And just to add a little bit of further thank you to the United Kingdom, does anyone know who led the charge in Mississippi for the final passage of the flat tax there? Douglas Carswell, yes, CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So he was a conservative before and he was a conservative after. So I am delighted to have Douglas in the United States and in Mississippi fighting for the cause of, among many other things, lower and simpler taxation. Why has this been such a big cause in the United States? Flat taxes in the U.S. have generally resulted in some level of tax cuts. That's true. But that's not been the big appeal to them. The big supporters of flat taxes in the U.S. have been small business, not large. Large business, for reasons that Andrew alluded to a little bit, large businesses are generally rather skeptical about flat taxes. I suspect because they have the accountants and the sophistication to be able to evade higher taxes. And the idea of a low and simple tax means that their competitive advantage over their competitors is reduced. But in the United States, at least, about 95% of business income flows through the individual level and is taxed as an individual, not as corporate income. And those small businesses, which provide the overwhelming share of employment and tax revenue, are extremely interested in and supportive of low tax. There are a couple of other reasons why low taxes or flat taxes have been very popular. First, U.S. states are always jostling with each other to try to gain an advantage over other states. Tax competition is a very important aspect of flat tax policy in the United States. States that have adopted flat taxes have seen inflows from other states of individuals, of entrepreneurs, and of businesses. And then the final reason that flat taxes have been popular and have been increasingly popular is that they are simple and they lock in the tax system. If you have one tax rate for everyone and it's a flat and easy to understand system, easy to pay, easy to grasp, it is very difficult for politicians then to start fiddling with the tax code, to raise it on one, to lower it on the other, to add an exemption here, a little bit of extra subsidy there. It makes not just an easier system to understand from the taxpayer and the voter's point of view and the businessman or the entrepreneur's point of view, it makes a tax system that the politicians cannot rig and change and fiddle for the benefit of whoever their favorite clients happen to be they on the right or on the left. And voters in the United States have tended to respond to that appeal. Will this translate to the national level of tax policy in the U.S.? I certainly hope so. But right now, our system remains in close competition with the United Kingdom's as the most complex, difficult to understand, and expensive to administer systems in the world. But the United States is a great laboratory for tax policy at the state level. And I'm hopeful that the good ideas bubbling up in the US states will eventually make their way to the national level, and I hope will find fruit in the United Kingdom as well.
Ted, thank you very much. I want to leave as much time for questions as possible, so I won't indulge myself with back and forth. But last but certainly not least, we have Tally Fraser, the assistant editor at Conservative Home.
Thank you very much for having me. I said to John that when I was asked to be on this panel, I looked back at what the Conservatives in opposition were last speaking about, sort of tax reform. And George Osborne, when he was Shadow Chancellor, set up a tax reform commission to look at flatter, simpler tax. That was 20 years ago, and nearly 15,000 pages of tax code later. I don't think we're doing any better, really. So the political realities of this is that politicians either haven't come to terms with the arguments that the panelists have been making, or they just haven't sort of had the guts to actually go ahead with it and do it. And that's part of the problem. You know, Lord Eliot said that there was a time where the tax code fell in number of pages and then immediately came back up. It went to 20 and then went straight back to 25. And that's a real problem if you have politicians who are aware of the problem, they see things that might make a difference, but they're not willing to take that plunge. So there was, even in the last government, there was an interview I did with John Glenn, who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury at the time, and he openly expressed, I am alarmed at the levels of tax in this country. He, at that point in time, was number 2 in the Treasury. I don't think we saw much change then, and we didn't see it through similar things that have been expressed from other politicians. And you know, the points that have been made across the panel is that spending has got to go hand in hand as well as tax policy. And you know, the Tories, the Shadow Chancellor is working up policies for public spending cuts, and I think we're going to see announcements on that later in the next couple of days. But it's a really big issue, and it's a very sizable issue. And if they're not willing to look at something like the triple lock, like Andrew says, then that presents a real concern. And it's funny as well, because Mel Stride, who is now the Shadow Chancellor, who has said, you know, the party said, we're not looking at the triple locks. He previously said the mathematical reality is that in the very, very long term, it's unsustainable. How can we have a situation where there is a recognition of the problem, and yet we continue to not have solutions? And that's the great thing about what the TPA are doing, is that they're putting forward some very detailed, very, you know, straightforward in the way that you put them, plans for those flatter, simpler taxes that Osborne was talking about back in 2005. You know, the Tories have they have an opportunity here to come up with the moral case for this. You know, the field is there for interesting ideas on taxation, on spending. And I would advocate that, you know, if people here believe that this is the way forward, the Tories currently think they can't touch it politically. They think it's politically untouchable to go after things like the triple lock. If you disagree, go and talk to your MPs, try and talk to the shadow cabinet, and actually prove that there are Tory members and there are voters out there who want to see the kind of reform that the TPA are putting forward that you guys believe in. And maybe at that point, they'll turn from what they say privately and actually start to see some sort of measures to deal with it publicly.
Tally, thank you very much. Reminded of what Nigel Lawson said in his memoirs, that the best way to simplify taxes is just to start abolishing taxes. Don't try and simplify individual taxes. First one will be inheritance tax. Get rid of that, you solve a lot of the problems with tax complexity. Right, we're going to kick off with Q&A. I saw that hand first at the back, on the back row there, Joanna. If you mention your name and if you've got a particular panelist you want to direct it at, please let us know.
This one's for Matthew. I'm Michael Mashinsky. I'm chairman of a AI consultancy, and we find it hard to find any company who can't cut 30% of their operating costs. Why can't government, McKinsey have forecast 180 billion potential savings if they were to, which would perhaps help Andrew's question of how we can start cutting money. What's your impression about that?
It's quite striking on the spending side of things how there's a big spike in spending, wasn't there, with the COVID years, and it hasn't really come down in any great way since. And similarly with public sector productivity, again, it sort of took a nosedive during the COVID years, and again, hasn't got back to the levels it was before. So there's definitely scope there. You know, it's within the sort of spitting distance of recent years that we did have a more productive, in this capacity, public sector. So actually, you can actually do it, but I think you need the will to do it. I also think that actually it may come about, like Angelico is saying, if we're forced into doing it, and then politicians say we're forced to actually do these things.
There is a gentleman on the back wall, Darwin.
Hi there, thank you. My name's Tom, I'm chair of the Guild for Conservatives. A quick comment and a question. Comment, thank you for this. It's just the sort of event I like coming to, so thank you for the intellectual input. My question, could you just provide a bit more evidence on what the impact on net revenues has been of a flat tax? Just, I have an assumption that maybe you don't raise as much, or where does it fit on the Lafitte curve? If just some evidence from the US, maybe Ted, would be helpful. Thank you.
The evidence, I mean, the U.S. is an extraordinarily diverse place, and you've got 14 states that have flat taxes at this point. Generally, states that have enacted flat tax have seen at least sort of previous levels of growth, frequently higher levels of growth, and therefore overall higher tax receipts than they would have seen, you know, ceteris paribus. It's a little difficult to measure state by state. You know, some of these states, like Colorado, has had a flat tax for almost 100 years. They were the real outlier on this. How do you work in things like the COVID effect and things like that? Generally, though, flat tax in the U.S. have not really been sold as tax cutting. They have been tax cutting, but only relatively moderately. They've really been sold more as tax simplification and state competitiveness measures than they've been sold as overall tax cutters. So the effect has not been dramatic on state revenue one way or the other, really.
Matthew, you want to
Can I make a very quick point as well about, Ted spoke very powerfully about the movement between the states. Of course, you're starting to see that in the UK as well, movement away from the UK. And we're seeing more and more sort of high net worth individuals sort of leaving the country because of the high rates of tax. But also much younger people. You know, people are thinking about, you know, where do we want to start our lives? Would it be better for us to go to somewhere like Dubai to mark our lives? So already you're seeing we're on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. So actually cutting it in elements would raise more revenue.
Okay, fantastic. There's a lady 2 doors down from the same gentleman there. Yeah.
Oh, hello. I'm Charlotte. I'm a tax lawyer. This Andrew made a very important point about the complexity of the tax code being expensive and unfair. Well, unfair mainly. And as a tax lawyer, I follow tax cases every week, and I can tell you that a huge amount of court time is taken up with dealing with infractions. And this is not only expensive for our justice system, but it also ties up HMRC hugely in having to take these cases. So I just wanted to make that comment and see whether you agreed with it.
Andrew, do you want to pick that up since it was a point you...
Well, I think she's agreeing with me. So.
Yeah, which is always very nice. Yeah. But I think it's an interesting point on court time specifically being taken up and the attendant costs of that. There is a gentleman here in the front row. You've got a microphone just there. So.
Oh, sorry. We have the dubious distinction of having turned Labour in Shrewsbury. And I was trying to explain to our MP that you destroy capital, you destroy wealth, and you destroy revenue. I'm running a diversified business, and I try to explain to her that in good years, one part of the business does well, another part of the business does badly. Yeah. But my main point is it not time to scrap inheritance tax?
Yeah.
Does anyone want to pick that up? Bar just. Ted, what happens in the States with death?
I mean, I could not agree more with you in the U.S. and in the UK context. In the U.S., federal inheritance tax, certainly some individuals will hit it, but the level of accumulated wealth you have to have is quite high before death taxes, inheritance taxes start becoming an issue. So it doesn't have quite the same heat in the U.S. as it does in the U.K. I mean, this has been, as I understand it, in the U.K., particularly an issue with the government's so-called reforms on farming, where I think what the government is doing is absolutely indefensible and is moving towards destroying the remaining UK agricultural sector. But writ large, inheritance taxes are the most unjust tax, I would argue. Why should you not be able to pass on to your descendants the fruits of your own work? I do not understand the moral case for this at all. They are also, I think, extremely bad for capital growth and capital investment.
Andrew Allen.
Yeah, so you've brought back a terrible, scary memory of doing the moral maze about 18 years ago on inheritance tax as a TPA spokesman. That was on exactly this moral point you're making. I spent quite a lot of time in Australia. They used to have death taxes. They abolished them. The Labour Albanese government is now thinking of bringing them back in. And the scramble of people who've got any wealth or assets or anything to try and put them offshore and trusts and spend, and the distraction, right, from instead productive uses of that capital, just with the rumors that they might bring it back in, right? Yeah, it's a very scary and distracting tax.
Unsurprisingly, the TPA have a campaign to scrap inheritance tax in its entirety. When we polled it, we found that every single cross break, which is male, female, whoever you vote for, Green Party included, either think it should be cut or abolished. It's the most unpopular tax by quite a considerable measure. The only group that we found that were largely pro it were people with PhDs. So our academics are.
Got a leaflet. There's a TPA leaflet at the back of the scrap inheritance tax.
This chap on the aisle there has been waiting a while. I think you're on. It's on. You can just go for it.
On? Oh, smashing, thank you. Hi, thank you. Craig Southern. I'm a borough councillor in Chorley, also a businessman. And I'm sitting here, particularly where Andrew and Telly were concerned, none along there, completely agreeing with you about the ridiculous nature of how we've got the tax and how you've already alluded to the fact that we ring fence certain things. From a political point of view, how do you then get elected? If, as Conservatives, we turn around and say, well, we're going to scrap the triple lock, because we don't agree with that, and we're going to scrap inheritance tax. The inheritance tax I completely agree with, but if you say I'm going to scrap the triple lock, none of your pensions are going to vote for you. So the question I want to ask the panel in general is, whilst I get the flat tax thing, and on the American issue, my brother's lived in the States for 38 years, there's a reason he's in Florida and not Virginia. Correct, because it works. Do we implement this as a one-off, as a direct hit, or do we do it progressively? Do we start with things like marginal tax and work our way up to this over a period of years, or do we simply say as a party, we're coming in and this is what's going to happen, and how do we sell that?
Very good question. I'm going to go to Tally first on the political element to that.
Yeah, sure. Totally understand, and it is a thing that is brought up often when talking about, we would like to look at scrapping the triple lock, but what do we do and where do we stand with our voters? But the thing is, the Tory voter base, as it is right now, it's not entirely sustainable one, in the sense that the average age of a Tory voter at the last election was 65, I think, and if you look at sort of the average rates, 1 in 8 of them will be dead by the next election. So you kind of have to start looking elsewhere and looking at policies that actually will promote economic growth and taxes that will promote economic growth. And he was here a minute ago, the shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Richard Fuller, and he said some interesting things on Sky News, not about the triple lock, but he said there are other taxes that aren't particularly efficient in terms of getting economic growth, such as stamp duty, land tax. Yep. And, you know, there are things for the Tories to be looking at on a broader note to reform tax, appeal to new voters, and actually getting the economy back on track.
Matthew.
I'm going to give another plug to the book. The subtitle of the book is Boosting Living Standards in an Age of Autocracy and AI. And the reason we talked about autocracy is because actually if you look around the world, a lot of the countries are doing very well, actually sort of more hardline, less democratic, having more free market policies. But actually we have the optimistic conclusion in there, having at the end of part 3, where you say you can still do it within a democracy. And we spoke to 5 former prime ministers, 9 former chancellors, lots of campaigners and strategists and what have you, to actually work out how you can go about it. And the key thing is to have that plan. So you need to actually really think about things ahead of time, sell it to the public, simplify that plan, get in with that mandate, have everything lined up in terms of the Treasury and the institutions and Parliament. So that's why I think actually what the party's doing this week in terms of actually thinking through things and doing that planning is a good thing.
Andrew Lillico.
So I think that an awful lot of politics of the past, a lot of political errors of the past 20 years have been built around the idea that you have to appease old people. So it's older people who own the houses, you can't let the house prices fall. It's older people who have the pensions, so you can't do anything with those. It's older people who use the NHS, so you have to do something with that. It's older people who have the deposits in the banks, so you have to bail out the banks. Everything seems to be geared around that. Now, I personally would trust old people to be as interested in making the world a better place as anybody else. So I think that what you have to do in politics ultimately is to that truth and virtue you should regard as your greatest allies. And if you argue for what you really believe to be true, then people see that. And people are crying out for authenticity in politics. They don't want politicians to just tell people what it is that they want to hear. They want politicians to tell them what they think makes the world a better place. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say, though, is you may think that cutting the triple lock's unpopular, but I'll tell you some things that are really unpopular. Things that are really unpopular are hitting a fiscal crisis where you have to get foreigners in to tell you to make your spending cuts instead of being brave and robust enough to do it yourself. And another thing that's really unpopular is not having any economic growth for decades. So each additional 10% of spending it means a reduction in your annual GDP growth of about 1%. So that 35% level of GDP spending to the 45% we have now by itself explains 1% of the reduction in our growth over the past 25 years. So that I think is a very important factor. It would be much more popular if you have stories that tell you about how you're going to make the economy grow faster, and which aren't just I'm going to do it in some vague way, but you have a concrete set of things which are proven to work to make economies grow faster. So that would be my answer on the politics. One last thing I would say is I beg for politicians to believe that they will be vindicated. So to do things which they accept will be unpopular in the short term, believing that they will work, and that when they work, people will see that they work. The Tories spent so long saying that they believed in things and then not doing them because they thought that it was unelected. And what that always says to me, and I think it says to every other voter, is you didn't believe it. Yeah. If you believed it, you would believe that it would work and you would be rewarded politically by it working. The fact that you think it's impossible to do tells me you never believed it in the first place.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Jeremy Maddox. I'm chairman of the largest Conservative branch in the country, in Fulham. My comment is, I think there are 3 taxes that need to be abolished within the first term of the Conservative government, the next one. And the first one is IHT, as everybody rightly pointed out. Yeah. The second one has got to be stamp duty, which is an iniquitous tax which punishes young people, prevents them from getting on the housing ladder, and prevents people from moving around the country. And the third one is capital gains tax, because frankly, it will pay for itself if we can abolish that tax. And those three taxes and the whole thing, not only will they partly pay for themselves by abolishing them, but they can be paid for by also abolishing the massive subsidies that are going on green energy projects and all the green subsidies. So, and if we do that, I do believe that we will win the next election. It's radical, but it should be done.
There wasn't a question in there, but I like everything. I like everything that you said. It's great. Is someone from this side? I've not seen a hand on this side for a while. Okay, there we are. There's a chap here.
Hi, I'm Anthony McKenna from Bedfordshire. One of the things about tax policy, and especially over the last 25 years, is repeated chancellors have said they would love to cut tax, but the truth of the matter, they always have a tax policy that intends to do things to citizens and not with them. Do you not agree that there should be a more pragmatic tax policy that builds on reward and actually, we've seen the business creation of over 1 million new businesses in between 2010 to 2024, that if we had a more competitive tax, that there would have been so far more new businesses and more jobs than what there were.
Dr. Broman made an approving noise, so I'm going to go to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things about the sort of the course of UK tax policy and politics since, I would say, the Blair-Brown governments that I found really frustrating is that I associate the kind of tax policy that you're criticizing with the rise of the Blair-Brown idea that tax policy should be manipulated in lots of little ways to achieve lots of things that might or might not be, in some cases probably are, basically desirable outcomes. But the net result of that is that the tax code grows longer and longer. The impact of each one of those little manipulative changes is diminished and distorted and probably entirely rubbed out by the other 24,000 pages of the tax code. And in the end, nothing of any great moment is achieved except that the burden of taxation and the complication of taxation rises and rises. And so I would love to see the UK and the US, because we do exactly the same thing, go away from a system where taxation is intended to produce small, discrete, supposedly predetermined changes in behavior towards a system of efficiency, easy collection, effective funding of genuinely necessary government functions, and away from the idea of manipulating and controlling individual behavior.
Andrew Allen.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. The problem with a manipulative tax code or even manipulative regulations is at best a few dozen or a few hundred people have been involved in thinking about it. What do they know? I mean, every individual knows such a small amount, really. How would they know, right? What we need is for taxes to get out of the way of our decision making, and then millions of people could be starting the kind of businesses you're talking about. You get a lot more minds involved in growing the economy. Government won't do it for us. They can't force us into doing it. We need to step forward. There's plenty of savings in the country. It's just not being invested because it's not attractive enough, because taxes and other things are in the way. So I think you're spot on there. Taxes and the government should get out of the way of that sort of growth, and will do it.
End of the aisle, just there.
Thank you. Ian Blocking from Gosport. First of all, to come back on what Andrew and Tally said, there is no moral justification for a pensioner to receive anything more than the average wage increase. The other things are an irrelevance. They were brought in at one time to correct what was seen as an anomaly, but at the moment there is no moral justification for it. Secondly, to come back to the subject of the matter, the single income tax, that is never going to happen while HMRC and the Treasury will fight against it, because they need a complicated tax code to justify their jobs.
We've got another event in the tent on smashing the blob, so you should come to that one. It's, loosely related. Tally, do you want to pick up on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, you make a totally valid point, and it makes sense that the TPA are going to have another event on it, because you consistently hear from Treasury ministers who will go in, have plans and ideas of what they want to do, and then you talk to them afterwards, and you are a bit like, what happened? Where did all of that go? And they just haven't been able to get to grips with the Treasury. And you do wonder whether it's a personal failing on their part, and you would hope that perhaps, you know, an elected government could do something about that. But it is a successive issue, so I look forward to the day where someone works out what to do about it.
Ted, just to say, my earlier PhD jibe was not at you.
Yeah, no, I tried to cover it up there.
But you're
no, I'm frequently embarrassed by it, but never more so than now.
Yeah.
I would say it's not just the Treasury and HMRC. OBR would throw a fit too.
And Andrew.
So I think that one of the reasons why taxes are so complex is because politicians want to pretend that they're not raising tax. And I think that one of the great merits of the single income tax proposal here, which would be shared by my alternatives, is that you make it more visible. I think that what should happen is that income tax rates should rise in more transparent ways when you raise spending, and that you should have a higher level of income tax. But politicians, for example, we had the weird business where spending went up enormously under Boris Johnson and then Sunak. And then Sunak was talking of cutting income tax rates as if somehow income tax was coming, as if taxes were going down. So we have the complexity as a consequence of this kind of mendacity in the system. We should be more transparent. When spending is very high, then the income tax should be very high as well.
Back corner.
Thanks very much. Ross Dye from Horsham, West Sussex. I was going to ask a question about IHT, but just quickly make a point. I've recently been the executor for an estate. I've had to fill in 3/4 of an inch thick schedule of papers for the IHT 400 form, creating loads of work for civil servants, and at the end of it, net result, no inheritance tax to pay whatsoever. So I had the anxiety of putting it together, and the civil servants have had to go through with it. But moving on to perhaps another area, we hear a lot, particularly on the left at the moment, about the ideas of wealth tax. What are the panel's views on that, and how do we fight against it? What are their points that we could raise against it?
Who wants to go first? Wealth tax? Yeah, Ted?
Well, I guess, from a purely selfish point of view, the idea of the UK instituting a wealth tax is going to drive a lot of extremely well-off, productive, and intelligent people to the United States. So, if one wished to take a narrowly selfish point of view about it, of course, they'll also go to the Gulf. Some of them will go to Singapore. Some of them, unless the Australian government manages to ruin it, will probably go to Australia. But what a catastrophic idea. The UK is already on the verge of bringing back concerns about brain drain. Don't bring back the policies of the 1960s where tax rates were at about 95%, and you had both brain drain and wealth drain. Terrible idea.
Anyone? Yeah, Andrew.
So. Some objections to, if you want some arguments against the wealth tax. So wealth taxes undermines the functions of the state. So the traditional concept of the state was that states existed because of family, promise, and property. And so to undermine the functions of the state by taxing one of the things which the state exists to protect, is a mistake. Secondly, wealth taxes create enormous complexity because people have to assess, because what you're talking about there is that there's no transaction. So there's no assigned value. So then you have to have very extensive assessments of what the value is of the thing that you're taxing. And that becomes very arbitrary and again equips people even more to have this rule of men rather than rule of law. And wealth taxes also tend to chase away wealth. And one of the things about Britain is that Britain has traditionally had what we used to think of as competitiveness, high competitiveness. So we were very good at attracting internationally mobile capital and high net worth individuals or high income individuals. At the moment, we're chasing both of those away. We will chase them away more with wealth taxes.
Yeah, very briefly, just I agree with. So am I on here? Yeah, agree with Andrew's objections. The new leader of the Greens, right, talks about this a lot. I won't name him. He uses a strange phrase which anyone with any savings would find offensive. He talks about people hoarding wealth. Have you heard this? Right. Okay. So look up hoarding in the dictionary. I did. It has two meanings, right? Both of which are, I think he intends to dig at people with wealth, right? The first meaning of hoarding is an irrational ability to get rid of possessions, right? Like you see those, more American TV shows where somebody's filled their house up with plastic bottles and they're crawling around on the ceiling or whatever, right? Hoarding, that sort of hoarding, that does not apply to wealth. The other form of hoarding is fear. You remember in 2020 when we're all rushing around the supermarkets? Right, there we go. That sort of hoarding does apply when you have a hostile government and hostile politicians coming after your wealth. You're not going to invest it in anything productive. You're going to hide it. You're going to save it. You're going to put it away. He is causing that sort of hoarding. Anyone mentions that, please go back at them. They are causing it, right? Why is wealth fearful? Because of them.
Final word to Tally.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing. As well as all the moral arguments, there is just the simple thing of wealth taxes don't work. Other countries have tried to do it. They've failed. A wealth tax is a bad idea and one that just does not do the trick.
Yeah, okay. I'm very sorry to everyone who had hands up and we couldn't get to. Please come back to the Think Tent throughout conference. We've got events on spending, on welfare, small business and entrepreneurship. We've got a live recording of our podcast, A Nation of Taxpayers, with the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, and much more besides. So thank you all for joining us at Packed Room for a really interesting way to kick off Think Tent, I think. So thank you all very much. And please thank the panelists too.